The sticker said $68,000. The salesman said it was built to last. The brochure talked about military-grade aluminum and next-generation engineering. What the brochure didn't mention was the 1-0 speed transmission that starts slipping at 45,000 miles, or the turbocharger that burns out before the loan is paid off, or the touch screen that controls your heat, your AC, and your defroster and crashes like a Windows 95 laptop in the middle of a February snowstorm in Ohio. America used to build machines that lasted a lifetime. Now we build machines that last exactly as long as the warranty. And here's the thing nobody wants to say out loud. This didn't happen by accident. There was a time when the American car was the standard. Not just in the United States, everywhere. When a farmer in Kansas or a steel worker in Pittsburgh bought a truck, he expected to hand it down to his son. When a family in Detroit saved up for a Cadillac, they weren't buying transportation. They were buying a declaration. A statement that said, "We build the best things in the world, and we know it." That wasn't arrogance. That was earned. The cars coming out of American factories in the post-war years were over-engineered in the best possible way. The engines were simple. The tolerances were tight. The steel was thick enough that a fender bender was just an inconvenience. You hammered it out and kept moving. People drove those cars into the ground and then kept driving them. A 1,955 Chevy pickup with 200,000 miles wasn't a collector's item. It was just a Tuesday. So what happened? Because somewhere between that 1,955 pickup and your neighbor's 2022 SUV that's already on its second transmission, something broke. Not the car, the philosophy behind it. The idea that a vehicle should be built to outlast the payments, outlast the decade, maybe outlast the person who bought it. That idea didn't fade slowly. It was replaced, deliberately, quietly, by people in boardrooms who never once got grease under their fingernails. This is the story of how the country that invented the modern assembly line forgot what it was building cars for in the first place. It's not a story about lazy workers or bad engineers. The engineers were brilliant. The workers showed up every single day. This is a story about what happens when the people making the financial decisions start outranking the people making the machines, and nobody in the room has the power to stop it. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why that $68,000 SUV feels like a ticking clock. And you're going to understand why the people who sold it to you knew that before you ever signed the paperwork. In the 1950s, the men running American car companies were obsessed with one thing, the machine itself. Ed Cole, the engineer who developed the small block Chevy 5.8, used to walk the factory floor at night. Not because he had to, because he couldn't sleep if he didn't. He wanted to see the engine come together with his own hands. He wanted to feel whether something was right before the data told him it was. That was the culture. The car was everything. The car was the point. Then the whiz kids showed up. After World War II, a group of young statisticians and analysts who had helped modernize the U.S. Air Force's logistics system were recruited by Ford. They were sharp, they were confident, and they believed that any problem at all, could be solved with the right spreadsheet. Robert McNamara was one of them. He would eventually become Secretary of Defense. But before that, he helped teach Detroit a new language. Not the language of torque and compression ratios, the language of cost per unit, acceptable loss rates, and return on investment. At first, it seemed like progress, and in some ways, it was. Ford became more organized. Costs came down. Production scaled faster than it ever had before. But underneath the efficiency gains, something was being quietly dismantled. The question on the factory floor used to be, how do we make this better? The new question, the question that the finance department started asking, louder and louder, until it drowned everything else out, was, how do we make this cheaper? Those two questions sound similar. They are not. When an engineer proposed a stronger grade of steel for a suspension component, the response used to be, does it work better? By the 1960s, the response became, how much does it cost? And if the cheaper version passed the minimum threshold, if it survived the required tests without failing, it went into production. Not because it was good, because it was good enough. And good enough was cheaper than excellent. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, A statistician named W. Edwards Deming was teaching Japanese manufacturers a completely different lesson. Deming had actually tried to teach this lesson to American companies first. They weren't interested. So he went to Japan, where a devastated post-war industry was desperate enough to listen. His message was simple and radical at the same time. Quality is not a department. It's not a checkbox at the end of the assembly line. It's a philosophy that has to be built into every single decision at every single level, from the first bolt to the final inspection. Zero defects isn't a slogan. It's the only acceptable standard. Toyota listened. Honda listened. They restructured their entire manufacturing process around that idea. They gave workers on the floor the authority to stop the entire production line if they spotted a defect. Not to report it. Not to flag it for a supervisor. To stop it. Right there. Because fixing a problem at the source costs almost nothing. Fixing it after 10,000 cars have already rolled off the line costs everything. Detroit did something different. Detroit calculated what they called the acceptable quality level. They ran the numbers and figured out that it was cheaper to let a certain percentage of defective cars reach customers and then pay out warranty claims on the ones that failed than it was to fix every flaw before it left the factory. Think about that for a moment. The decision was made, explicitly, in writing, in boardroom presentations, that some customers would get broken cars, and that was fine. Because the math said it was fine. The engineers knew this was wrong. Some of them said so. But by the late 1960s, the engineers weren't running the meetings anymore. The finance guys were. And the finance guys had a number for everything except the one thing that can't be put on a spreadsheet. Reputation. Because here's what the acceptable quality level calculation left out. The customer who gets a broken car doesn't just file a warranty claim and forget about it. He tells his brother. His brother tells his coworkers. And when the next generation of that family goes to buy a car, they don't forget. They never forget. Detroit traded its reputation for a margin improvement that looked great in a quarterly report and catastrophic in a decade. The bean counters won the argument. The consumers paid for it. And the worst part, the part that should keep every executive in that industry awake at night, is that the same logic, dressed up in new language and new technology, is still running the show today. Detroit in 1972 was still living in its own mythology. The big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, controlled more than 80% of the American car market. The highways were full of their products. The economy was built around their factories. Detroit wasn't just a city. It was a proof of concept, evidence that American industry was the most powerful force on earth. And then, October 1973 happened. The Arab oil embargo didn't just raise gas prices. It exposed something that everyone inside the industry already knew but refused to say. Detroit had absolutely no idea how to build a small, efficient, reliable car. They had spent 30 years perfecting the art of the land. Yacht, massive V, 8 engines, long wheelbases, chrome, everything. And the moment the market demanded something different, they had nothing. No platform, no experience, no philosophy for it. So they panicked. The Ford Pinto was rushed to market in 25 months. For context, a normal vehicle development cycle at the time took closer to 43. Corners weren't cut, they were amputated. The Pinto's fuel tank was positioned in a way that made it vulnerable to rupturing in a rear-end collision. Ford's own internal documents, which later became public, showed that engineers had identified the problem. The cost to fix it was estimated at $11 per vehicle. Ford calculated that paying wrongful death settlements would be cheaper than fixing every car. They chose not to fix it. People died. The Chevy Vega had a different kind of catastrophe. Its aluminum engine block was supposed to be innovative, lighter, more efficient, ahead of its time. Instead, it warped. It burned oil. It overheated. The cylinder walls wore out so fast that some engines were destroyed before 50,000 miles. Owners described watching the temperature gauge climb in real time, knowing what was coming, powerless to stop it. The car that was supposed to save GM's small car reputation became the punchline that defined it. And while all of this was happening, something quiet was occurring in showrooms across the country. A factory worker in Cincinnati, fed up with his third Vega repair in 2 years, walked into a Honda dealership on a dare. He bought a Civic. He drove it for 11 years without a single major repair. He told everyone he knew. And they told everyone they knew. And slowly, steadily, without a single marketing campaign or a single Super Bowl commercial, the Japanese automakers built something that Detroit's entire advertising budget couldn't buy back once it was gone. Trust. The reliability gap wasn't a statistic. It was personal. It was the guy at the barber shop who said, "I'll never buy American again," and meant it. It was the family that switched to Toyota in 1978 and never looked back. Not in the 80s, not in the 90s, not ever. It became cultural. It became inherited. Parents passed it down to their kids like a warning. Detroit spent the next 4 decades trying to close a gap they had created in a single decade of arrogance and panic. And the brutal truth is this: they never fully closed it. The J.D. Power surveys got better. The recall numbers improved. The engineering genuinely advanced. But the ghost of the Pinto and the Vega never completely left the room. Once you lose that kind of trust, you don't get it back with a press release. You don't get it back with a redesign. You get it back one car at a time, one owner at a time, over generations if you're lucky. And Detroit was never quite lucky enough. In 1984, General Motors did something almost unthinkable. They sat down with Toyota, their fiercest competitor, the company that was systematically taking their market share, and they agreed to build a factory together. The location was Fremont, California. The plant had actually been a GM facility before, shut down in 1982 because it was one of the worst performing factories in the entire American auto industry. Absenteeism was catastrophic. Quality was a disaster. The union relationship was openly hostile. Toyota agreed to reopen it, with the same workers. And what happened next should have changed everything. Within 2 years, the Fremont plant was producing some of the highest quality vehicles in North America. The same workers who had been running one of GM's worst factories were now running one of its best. Absenteeism collapsed. Defects collapsed. The production line ran with a precision that GM executives who visited couldn't quite believe they were seeing with their own eyes. The difference wasn't the workers. It was never the workers. The difference was the system. Toyota brought with them something called the Toyota Production System, a manufacturing philosophy built on 2 pillars. The first was Jidoka, the idea that any worker on the line had not just the right, but the obligation to stop production the moment they spotted a defect. Not report it, stop it. The second was Kaizen, the idea that improvement is never finished. Every worker, every day, is looking for a way to do their job better. Not because management told them to, because it's built into the culture as a source of pride. GM had a front row seat to all of this. They sent managers to Fremont specifically to study it. They took notes. They wrote reports. They flew back to Michigan full of ideas. And then Detroit rejected almost every single one of them. Not officially. Nobody sent a memo that said, "Ignore what you learned in California." It was subtler than that, and in some ways more damaging. Middle managers back in Michigan felt threatened. The Toyota Production System gave power to the workers on the floor, and in Detroit's top-down hierarchy, that was dangerous. If the guy on the assembly line could stop the whole operation, what did that say about the guy in the supervisor's chair? What did it say about the layers of management above him? So the ideas got watered down. They got filtered through committees. They got translated into Detroit's language, which meant they got turned into programs with names and budgets and quarterly reviews, instead of philosophies that lived in the hands of the people doing the actual work. Kaizen became a PowerPoint presentation. Jidoka became a suggestion box. The soul of it died somewhere between Fremont and Detroit. There's a lesson here that goes beyond cars. You can copy a blueprint. You can photograph every inch of a factory, document every process, study every metric. But you cannot copy a culture. Culture isn't written down anywhere. It lives in the thousands of small decisions that people make every single day when nobody is watching. It lives in whether a worker feels proud of what he's building or just relieved to get through the shift. It lives in whether a manager sees quality as a personal commitment or as someone else's department. Toyota had spent decades building that culture from the ground up, through crisis and recovery, through Deming's influence and their own brutal self-examination after World War II. GM thought they could absorb it in a field trip. They were wrong. And the cars that came out of Michigan in the late 1980s and 1990s proved it. Some improvements, yes. Some genuine progress, but still plagued by the same fundamental problem. A corporate structure that prioritized the quarterly report over the long-term commitment to quality that Toyota was treating as a religion. The Nummi plant ran successfully for 25 years. GM shut it down in 2010, when the company went bankrupt and needed to cut costs. Toyota eventually left too. The building sat empty for a while. Then Elon Musk turned it into the first Tesla factory. History has a sense of humor. Here's a question that nobody in the showroom is going to answer honestly. How long is this car actually supposed to last? Not how long the warranty covers, not how long the financing runs. How long is the machine itself, the engine, the transmission, the electrical system engineered to function without major failure? The answer, if you could get a straight one, would tell you everything about the modern American auto industry. Somewhere in the 1990s, a quiet shift happened in how Detroit thought about vehicle longevity. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was just economics, following its own cold logic to its natural conclusion. The leasing model started to dominate. Instead of selling a car to someone who would own it for 15 years, manufacturers found a better business. Sell the same car to the same person 5 times over the course of 15 years. Or better yet, never sell it to them at all. Just rent it to them. Forever. In 3-year cycles. The lease became the engine of the modern auto industry, and it changed everything about how cars were designed. If your customer is going to return the vehicle in 36 months, the engineering calculus shifts completely. The car needs to feel perfect for 36 months. It needs to look perfect, drive perfectly, have 0 major issues during the lease term because that's when the customer is your responsibility. What happens after month 37 is someone else's problem. Literally. It's the next owner's problem, or the used car dealer's problem, or the bank's problem. So why would you engineer a transmission to last 200,000 miles when 60,000 is enough to get through 2 full lease cycles? Why would you use a more expensive rubber compound in a cooling hose if the cheaper one will hold up through the warranty period? Why would you over-engineer anything when just good enough for 36 months is all the market is demanding? You wouldn't, not if your job depends on keeping costs down and margins up. And this is where it gets darker. Because planned obsolescence isn't just about making things that wear out, it's also about making things that can't be fixed. A modern American vehicle is increasingly designed in a way that makes independent repair either extremely difficult or financially irrational. The diagnostic software is proprietary. The parts are only available through dealerships. The components are integrated in ways that require specialized tools to access. The message is clear, even if it's never spoken. When something breaks, don't fix it. Buy new. The other weapon in this strategy is feature creep. And this one is brilliant, in a deeply cynical way. American consumers, and this is not an insult, it's a documented market behavior respond to features. Put a 1.5-inch touchscreen in a truck and buyers will line up for it. Give them 3.0. Color ambient lighting, a 2.6 speaker sound system, a panoramic roof that opens with a voice command, and massaging seats that adjust automatically based on the driver's posture, and suddenly, the conversation stops being about whether the transmission is reliable. It's about whether you get the massage seat package in the $72,000 trim or whether you have to step up to the $81,000 trim to get it. Those features have spectacular profit margins. A heated steering wheel costs the manufacturer about $40 to add. They charge $400 for it as a standalone option, or bundle it into a package that costs $3,000. The touchscreen infotainment system that everyone complains about costs significantly less to produce than the mechanical components it replaced, because now, instead of a dedicated climate control knob, and a dedicated audio knob, and a dedicated everything knob, you have a single screen running software, cheaper to build, wildly more expensive to repair when it fails. Which it does. Which it will. Meanwhile, the question of whether the differential is going to hold up at 90,000 miles gets buried under a brochure full of connectivity features and driver assistance technology. This is not an accident. This is a product strategy. And the cruelest part of it is that it works. People buy it. People finance it and lease it and trade it in and do it all over again. Because the interior is beautiful and the screen is big and the truck looks like it could survive a nuclear event, even though the turbocharger underneath it is running on borrowed time. Detroit figured out something Toyota never had to. If you make the car exciting enough to look at, people will stop asking how long it's going to last. A modern Ford F-150 has approximately 150 million lines of code. A Boeing 737 has about 6.5 million. Let that sit for a second. The most popular vehicle in the United States, a pickup truck that millions of Americans use to haul lumber and drive to Costco, is running software that is 20 times more complex than a commercial aircraft. And, unlike the aircraft, which has redundant systems and federally mandated maintenance schedules and crews of certified engineers checking every component before every flight, your truck is sitting in a parking lot in the rain, running all of that code on hardware that came from the lowest bidder supply chain. This is the complexity paradox of the modern American vehicle. The engineering is genuinely impressive. The technology is, in many cases, world-class. And yet the reliability has gotten worse, not better, because every new system added to improve one thing creates 3 new ways for something else to fail. Take the 1.0 speed automatic transmission. It was introduced to improve fuel economy. More gear ratios means the engine can run at optimal RPM across a wider range of speeds, which saves gas and helps manufacturers hit the federal fuel economy targets they're legally required to meet. The engineering logic is sound. But a 1.0 speed transmission has dramatically more components than the 4 speed it replaced. More clutch packs, more solenoids, more fluid passages, more sensors, more things that can go wrong. And when they do go wrong, the diagnosis alone can cost hundreds of dollars before a single part is replaced. The same story plays out with cylinder deactivation. The idea is elegant. At highway speeds, when you don't need all 8 cylinders firing, the system shuts down 4 of them to save fuel. The execution requires a sophisticated network of oil pressure actuators, solenoids, and software controllers to make it happen seamlessly. When the system works, you save maybe 8 to 10% on fuel. When it doesn't work, and it doesn't always work, you get a vibration, a misfire code, and a repair bill that eats every dollar you saved in fuel costs for the next 4 years. And then there's the software itself. The ghost problems that modern vehicle owners describe are unlike anything the previous generation of car owners ever dealt with. Your grandfather's truck didn't randomly refuse to start because a module lost communication with another module. His radio didn't require a software update to function. His backup camera didn't go black and stay black because of a firmware conflict. These are the new failure modes: invisible, unpredictable, and often impossible to diagnose without equipment that only the dealership has. The independent mechanic, the guy who used to be able to fix anything with a decent set of tools and enough experience, is increasingly helpless in front of a modern American vehicle. The diagnostic ports are there. The OBD reader can pull codes, but the codes point to systems so deeply integrated and so thoroughly proprietary that without the manufacturer's specific software, you're guessing. And guessing with modern vehicles is expensive. This complexity wasn't purely a choice. Some of it was forced. The corporate average fuel economy standards, CAFE standards, require manufacturers to hit specific fleet-wide fuel economy numbers or pay significant penalties. The targets have been tightening for decades. And the American manufacturers, who built their entire profit model around large, heavy, powerful vehicles, have had to perform engineering gymnastics to make those vehicles meet fuel economy standards without fundamentally changing what they are. The result is a full-size truck that gets passable fuel economy through a combination of cylinder deactivation, a turbo 4-cylinder option that nobody completely trusts in a truck that weighs 3 tons, lightweight aluminum body panels that require specialized repair techniques, and a transmission with so many speeds that it sometimes feels like it can't decide which gear it wants to be in. Each of those solutions is a compromise, and each compromise adds complexity. And complexity, in a machine that lives outside in all weather conditions and gets driven hard by people who expect it to work every single time, is the enemy of reliability. The irony is thick. The regulations designed to protect the environment have pushed manufacturers toward engineering choices that make vehicles more disposable. Cars that are harder to fix, more dependent on proprietary software, and more likely to generate large repair bills in year 5 and 6, which conveniently accelerates the decision to trade in and buy new. The loop is closed. The machine keeps running, and the consumer is inside it, wondering why the check engine light is on again. Reese. Ford stopped making the Focus in 2018. GM killed the Cruze in 2019. The Chevrolet Impala, a nameplate that had been part of American culture since 1958, was discontinued in 2020. Dodge stopped making the Dart. Chrysler stopped making almost everything that didn't ride on a truck platform. The sedan is dead in America, or close enough to dead that the difference doesn't matter. This didn't happen because Americans stopped needing practical, affordable, fuel-efficient transportation. It happened because Detroit couldn't figure out how to build a reliable small car at a price that made business sense, and rather than solve that problem, they walked away from it. The math was ruthless. A compact sedan sells for $22,000 to $28,000. The margin on that vehicle, after manufacturing costs, dealer incentives, marketing, and warranty reserves, is thin enough that a single bad model year can wipe out the entire profit from that segment. Meanwhile, a full-size pickup truck sells for $45,000 to $85,000, with margins that are 3 to 4 times higher per unit. The truck doesn't have to be dramatically better engineered. It just has to be big enough and loaded with enough features that the buyer feels like they're getting something substantial for their money. So Detroit made a decision. Abandon the segments where you have to compete on value and reliability, and dominate the segment where you can compete on image, size, and brand identity. It worked. Financially, it worked spectacularly. The Ford F-Series has been the best-selling vehicle in the United States for 47 consecutive years. The Ram 1500, the Chevy Silverado. These are not just products, they are cultural artifacts. They represent a version of American identity that is deeply emotional and almost entirely immune to rational purchasing analysis. A man who buys a $72,000 truck to commute to an office job and occasionally haul furniture from IKEA is not making a logical decision. He's making an identity decision. And Detroit understood that before most people were willing to say it out loud. The truck buyer will tolerate things that a sedan buyer never would. He'll tolerate a repair bill that would make a Toyota Camry owner faint because the truck is part of who he is. Selling it would feel like a defeat, and Detroit counts on that. The emotional switching cost is enormous, and they exploit it. But here's what gets buried in all of that brand mythology. The long-term ownership math on a modern domestic truck is genuinely brutal. Consumer Reports and J.D. Power data consistently show that after the warranty period, American trucks and SUVs have significantly higher maintenance costs than their Japanese equivalents. A 2018 F-150 at 80,000 miles is statistically far more likely to need expensive unscheduled repairs than a 2018 Toyota Tacoma at the same mileage. Not because the F-150 is a bad vehicle at 80,000 miles, it's not. But because the complexity, the turbochargers, the 1.0, speed transmissions, the electronic systems, they all start accumulating failures at a rate that the simpler, more conservatively engineered Japanese trucks simply don't. The truck buyer who trades in every 4 or 5 years, which is exactly who Detroit is designing for, never feels this. He's gone before the bills arrive. The person who feels it is the second owner. The guy who buys the used truck at 65,000 miles because he can't afford new, and discovers at 85,000 miles that he's staring at a $3,400 repair on a vehicle he paid $28,000 for. That person doesn't show up in Detroit's customer satisfaction surveys. He's not in the focus groups. He's in a forum at midnight, reading about other people's transmission problems and wondering how he's going to get to work on Monday. Detroit solved their profitability problem. They did not solve their reliability problem. They just found a way to sell cars to people who could afford to not care about the reliability problem, at least not while the vehicle was still new. In 1950, W. Edwards Deming stood in front of a room full of Japanese business leaders and told them something that should have been obvious, but felt, at the time, almost radical. He said, "Quality is not an accident. It is always the result of intelligent effort. It is a choice made deliberately, at every level of an organization. Every single day." Japan listened. America didn't. And the next 70 years of automotive history are the record of what that choice looks like. Compounded across decades, and millions of vehicles, and billions of dollars of warranty claims and repair bills, and lost consumer trust. The American car industry is not staffed by idiots. It never was. The engineers at Ford and GM and Stellantis are among the most talented in the world. The workers on the assembly lines in Michigan and Kentucky and Tennessee are skilled and committed. The problem has never been talent. The problem has always been priorities. When you optimize for the quarterly earnings report, you get cars that are brilliant for 36 months. When you optimize for the 200,000-mile engine, you get something else entirely, something that costs more to build, takes longer to develop, and doesn't generate the same short-term returns. But it builds something that no marketing budget can manufacture. A reputation that lasts longer than the loan. Toyota didn't become the most reliable brand in the world by accident. They became it by deciding, at a foundational level, that reliability was not a feature. It was the product. Everything else, the design, the technology, the comfort, those were things you added on top of a machine that you had already committed, unconditionally, to making last. Detroit made a different decision. They decided that reliability was one feature among many, and not necessarily the most profitable one. They decided that a customer who doesn't know how long the transmission will last is a customer who might buy an extended warranty. They decided that complexity was a competitive advantage because it locked customers into the dealer service network. They decided that the truck buyer's emotional attachment to the brand was a more durable asset than the truck itself. And for a long time, that strategy worked. It still works, in the narrow financial sense. The balance sheets of the big three are not disasters. Ford had one of its most profitable years on record recently. GM continues to generate billions in revenue. The trucks keep selling. The SUVs keep selling. But there is a number that doesn't show up on those balance sheets. It's the number of Americans who drive a Japanese car today because their grandfather drove an American one and swore, after the third repair in 2 years, that he'd never go back. It's the number of first-time buyers who never even considered a domestic brand because the cultural assumption built in the 1970s and never fully dismantled is that Japanese means reliable and American means a gamble. That number is the real cost of the decisions made in boardrooms 50 years ago. And it is still being paid every single day in showrooms across the country where a young couple walks past the Ford lineup and heads straight for the Honda. Is it possible for Detroit to turn this around? Genuinely? Yes. The talent is there. The manufacturing capacity is there. The history of what is possible, the pre-MBA era, the nummy experiment, the isolated moments when American manufacturing has risen to meet a challenge, that history is there too. But it would require something that is almost impossible to mandate from the outside. It would require a cultural decision, made at the very top of these organizations, to stop treating reliability as a cost center and start treating it as the foundation. To stop engineering cars for the warranty period and start engineering them for the driveway. To stop optimizing for the quarterly report and start optimizing for the owner who is going to be living with this machine for the next 15 years. That is not a technical problem. The engineers can solve technical problems. That is a values problem. And values problems are the hardest ones to fix because they require the people at the top to admit that the way they've been doing things, the way that made them rich and powerful and dominant, was wrong. Deming said it in 1950. The Japanese proved it by 1980. The nummy plant demonstrated it in California in 1984, with American workers building world-class cars on American soil. The information has never been the problem. The choice has always been the problem. And until the choice changes, until the person signing off on the budget decides that a transmission that lasts 200,000 miles is worth more than a touchscreen that looks good in a commercial, the reliability gap will keep growing, quietly, one warranty expiration at a time. The old American car is a legend, not because of how it was built, but because of why it was built. It was built by people who believed that the machine mattered, that the person who bought it mattered. That craftsmanship was its own justification, independent of the margin it generated. That belief built an industry. Losing it is what's been slowly dismantling one.